high school whose class itself was over 650 people go to a college on the East Coast. How could I even afford it? And they said, well, there are these liberal arts colleges on the East Coast that are recruiting for the first time. And this is 1969, 1970 in Seattle, where we were getting introduced to small liberal arts colleges on the East Coast that were recruiting on the West Coast for the first time. And they really wanted students on the West Coast. They were just beginning to find out and discover the West Coast. Because I had some strong academics and sports, I also happened to be the senior class president, which, by the way, was the last time I ran for a public office before. It's true. I never run for public office before. High school class president, and I actually won. They were recruiting. It seemed to fit. This college called Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, was seeking recruitments out there, and it caught my attention because they were promising that by the second year, my class sizes would go from something like 25 to maybe 10 or 12, maybe the maximum 15. And I'll talk about that later.
You know, actually, I was going to ask you about going to Bowdoin College because it's a predominantly white state. And how was it being the only Asian in the college? Well, maybe not the only, just a handful. There's probably more moose in Maine than there were Asian, right?
You know, I can talk all night long about my college education. Bowdoin was very special. It's in the southern part of Maine. And at that time, the very first year was an all-men's college. The total population of all the classes was about 1,300. So it was smaller than my high school. I walked on to this beautiful campus and I went, wow. And they wanted me so badly that they offered me full scholarship all 4 years. Room and board, everything else, work study on the campus. They thought I was going to be a doctor and engineer, kind of very Asian of them. And I was pretty good in math, you know, like Asians are. We're always good in math. We know our numbers. I said, yeah, I might be interested in that. And by the second year, I was so enthralled with everything from philosophy to history of religions to arts, all of the stuff that liberal arts colleges really emphasize. I was so enthralled by those studies. In fact, I still remember in the history of religions, my history teacher saying, you're going to learn about the spatial temporal manifold of the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. These intrigued me, you know. Part of it too was I'd never been on the East Coast before. My first year, I had to dig myself out of the dormitory from 9 feet of snow. It was one of those historic, every 10-year snowbound histories that Brunswick and the state of Maine experiences. And so that got kind of used to it. But I slowly discovered that the state of Maine was a beautiful, beautiful state. And while I headed home the first summer out of more loneliness and wanting to get back into the urban setting, I realized the beauty of Maine and ended up the next 3 years, all summer, being in the state of Maine, introducing myself to the Penobscot Indian tribe in Maine, being a volunteer and then eventually being hired with a program called Upward Bound to help recruit kids, low-income kids, all in the state of Maine, from Indian tribes to the French Canadians along the Maine border, and talking to their parents and saying how wonderful Bowdoin College was, and you ought to give your child, who in many cases were the first kids in their family to go to college, an opportunity to experience that college education. So I ended up spending 3 out of the 4 summers on the campus of Maine. Loved it, loved the environment. There's a story about moose. In the middle of winter, one of the sports that I ended up liking was to put on snowshoes and go with the other kids in the Bowdoin campus to track down moose in the middle of winter to see if we can catch them mating. This is what we did for fun in college. But while we did that, I ended up loving the environment. That was my exposure, because as an urban kid, I didn't have this kind of environment. And it caused me to really understand what beautiful environment was and how precious it was, and how areas like Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire can take pride in their environment. That caused me to pay attention at an early age of how environment should be part of our quality of life. And of course, it stayed with me as I came across the states back to the state of California for law school.
I think we learned something more about AREAA and the moose, right?
Well, let me leave this, because I was very serious academically, as you can tell, at Bowdoin, and I enjoyed all the years. And I used to joke to people, and I still do, because I hadn't gone back to my college in over 40 years from when I graduated, just until 2 weeks ago. So I had not been back for 40 years, because it wasn't because I disliked it. I loved the college. It was because my love for learning had been opened up at that college. And I ended up earning, of course, the summa cum laude levels, but it was because I loved learning. And I often joke that those of you who weren't around and never saw the television series called Kung Fu, David Carradine, there was some criticism of having a Caucasian guy play an Asian Kung Fu guy. But part of my theory was that Bowdoin College was kind of like my monastery. It allowed me to really engage academically in everything that I wanted to learn without limits. I had professors at my touch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I had my Russian class. There were 2 of us for 4 years in my Russian class. By the way, I was going to be a Sino-Soviet diplomat, so I really was into Russian and all the other stuff. And to have professors that were eating dinner with us, it was the last time where someone asked me, what do you really want to do in life? These were academic professors that I really were engaged in, and to have that kind of attention was a monastery that prepared me, that I didn't feel the need to go back for a number of reasons, only because I was prepared to change the world, and I was so busy with my life for the next 40 years that I felt going back was kind of disservice until I had accomplished everything I wanted to do in life. And I've been so busy in those 40 years of so many different things that I've experienced. But I often look back and say thank you. So I went back after 40 years 2 weeks ago to personally thank them for the preparation. And I was met with some incredible graduates of my same class who are also doing similar things, like Jeffrey Canada, who is head of the Harlem Children's Zone, and changing all the lives of African American and Latino kids in Harlem. And he spent his career, and we were able to catch up with each other. Some of my professors and the others were still there, and a lot of compliments, but that's the way I treated college. It was a monastery that I could study. I excelled in it, but I also took those lessons and tried to do what I could to honor what Bowdoin College allowed me. I also was a jokester in college. I have to tell you, being one of 5 Asians on the campus allowed me to create some stories about myself, because I did encounter other kids that were pretty uppity. You know, they were from very prestigious, well-to-do families. They were often telling me how their parents were the CEO of this and that, and kind of looking at me like, how did you get into Bowdoin? who did you know? What kind of background did you have to be so privileged to have this kind of education? And these were people who all their lives went to private schools. You know, some very prestigious schools like Exeter and all the others, Phillips Academy and the others, and they got into Bowdoin College. So I decided, okay, I'm going to match you. So half the campus, I tried to persuade that, okay, I am somebody famous. Says, okay, well, okay, finally, we got you to admit. Who are you then? Well, I'm the younger brother of who? Someone named Bruce. Half the campus was the younger Bruce Lee, because they knew I'm from Seattle. They looked it up and this, oh God. And then the other half of the campus, who, by the way, were smart enough to look at, said, you know, Lee's brother. Who do you really know? And of course, the other half, I had to correct. So 40 years later, I went back to college and I had to correct a rumor that I had spread that I was the great-grandson of Robert E. Have them look it up. So I pulled the pranks on everybody, but it was my way of saying, you know, I didn't want to tell my story of being poor immigrant family. I didn't want to repeat that constantly. I didn't want to give them the impression that Asians were poor, and so I had some pride, so I made up a bunch of stories, but eventually they learned who I was, and all the more to them, they become a lot of good friends, and I met them 40 years later, and some of these pointed at me saying, you were a pretty big jokester then. And you know, I keep those relationships well in hand. I was lucky to land a Watson Fellowship. Thomas Watson is IBM. And they had this fellowship that was part of colleges across the country, where the weirder project you wrote, the more appropriate that it might be to be funded for a year. So when I graduated, I earned the opportunity to apply for one of these scholarships. And I looked at all the other applicants that were successful in what they applied for. Studying butterflies in South America, mushrooms in Brazil, in Europe, all kinds of weird stuff. So I thought I would weird them out and do a study there, because I really wanted to kind of take a break after college and do something different. This is 1974, 74, 75, and 2 years earlier, Henry Kissinger and President Nixon had opened up China to the rest of the world to kind of discover what was going on in People's Republic of China. And so I wrote a proposal. I would like to go to Hong Kong and China and study the Communist Youth League and compare their values to the American Boys and Girl Scouts. God, that's weird. Let's give it to them. And they did. They gave me the 1 year thing, and I flew into Hong Kong and went to the University Service Center that was next to the airport, and this is where all the China scholars were, and spent a whole year interviewing people, and I got a chance to go into China at the time, and you know, had a lot of people looking at me like I was really weird, but I was there. I had Mandarin. In fact, I took Mandarin in college at the same time. I took Russian because I was preparing for a Sino-Soviet diplomat experience, and got to interview hundreds of people that were in China. At that time, as you recall, that was still part of the Cultural Revolution, and a lot of disenchantment with youth about what that was. So I had a lot of opinions about what was going on in China, and I had to, but I did a research, I collected, in fact, I still have volumes of these Communist Youth League magazines that I was reading through and trying to kind of understand what value setting the Communist Party was instilling in their youth, and how that love of country, love of society, you know, when they were growing up, a lot of these kids were just inculcated as country first and self in the second. They really were trying to love their country first, and how those values were compared to the Boys and Girls Scouts in America, how to be selfless, how to do community, trying to compare these two societies that were seemingly at odds politically, but the values about loving country were there to study. And I ended up writing a paper to the Watson Fellowship. And from there, I changed my whole career. I decided that international thing was not for me. In fact, I learned very quickly, because part of my experience in that year living abroad was I got to engage with other people that worked in various State Departments and ambassadors from different countries. And my kind of idealistic thought was I was going to go in the State Department and then maybe come back and be a diplomat in the State Department. They said, well, you're kind of kidding yourselves, because there's a lot of barriers to Asians and to minorities in the State Department. I said, really? Tell me that. And a lot of stories were shared with me about how difficult it was to do so. And I asked all the China scholars, was this true? And they kind of said, yeah, the State Department's a pretty conservative group. You and your long hair and your weird mustache ain't going to cut it. So I said, well, maybe I would change there. And at the time, I was also living with my grandfather in a part of Hong Kong at the time, and really experiencing the urban life. I mean, real urban life. Poor folks on the street, street vendors. And I was kind of the privileged academic that was involved in their lives. And I realized that maybe this was not my calling on the international level. Maybe I had to go back and help society. So I applied to law school from Hong Kong at the time, and this place called Berkeley paid attention to my application and invited me to come to Berkeley. And I got into law school, and actually, literally, I didn't actually go back home to Seattle. I flew directly from Hong Kong after I wrote my paper back to Berkeley to begin law school.
Interesting. You know, it really sounds like your college life and post-college life was really a lot of fun, and you learned a lot. But in your public and personal life, did you encounter any discrimination? And then you mentioned about the bamboo ceiling. Can you talk about that?
Well, you know, I didn't really realize, when I went to law school, I had a philosophy that perhaps being in the legal field would be more promising. I didn't realize how necessary that skill set would be until I actually arrived on the Berkeley campus. And after the first semester, thrust into the politics of Berkeley, UC Berkeley, where at the time the big issue was Asians had made it. There was no longer any barriers. Therefore, let's get rid of affirmative action for Asians in law school. And I said, really? Let me take a look at the facts here. And we started studying the facts and realizing that there's still a lot of barriers and that there was a lot of discriminatory acts that were going on, and that I was already engaged in the Chinese community in Oakland at the time, trying to help seniors and people deal with housing discrimination. The campus issues translated into a recruitment by